Tonight, we drift back into the long, frozen nights of the Middle Ages. But before then, welcome to Story Zone. This is another quiet journey through time. A time of flickering candlelight, straw floors, and long, bitter winters. This is a story of how ordinary people, poor peasants, tired farmers, and quiet families survived the cold long before modern heating, soft blankets, or even socks as we know them. So, start by closing your eyes now. Let your body relax and move, and imagine the cold wind outside as we begin this sleepy history. Back in the Middle Ages, the cold was not just a season, it was a way of life. Winters were long, very long, in some parts of Europe. Snow stayed on the ground for months, and there was no such thing as central heating, no electric heaters, no warm water on demand. The people of this time had to find their own ways to keep warm. They lived inside small houses made from wood, mud, straw, or stone. These homes were cold. The walls were thin. The floors were made of packed dirt. And the cold? It came in through every crack and corner. So how did they survive? Let's take a closer look. In most homes, the hearth was the center of everything. The hearth was the fire, and the fire was life. In a simple peasant hut, the fire usually sat in the middle of the room. Sometimes it was just a pile of burning logs, with smoke rising up through a small hole in the roof. There were no chimneys, not yet. The smoke would fill the room. It stung the eyes, made you cough, turned the ceiling black, but it also gave warmth and light. At night, the family would gather around it. They would sit close, wrapping themselves in wool or old cloaks. Some brought straw near the fire to sleep a little warmer. The fire never went out if they could help it. They fed it twigs and dried cow dung, anything that could burn, because once the fire died, it was very hard to start again. To fight the cold, peasants wore layers, but they didn't have closets full of clothes. Many had only one outfit, maybe two. If they were lucky, their clothes were made from wool. Wool was warm, thick, and itchy, but it helped keep out the chill. Under the wool, some wore linen, a softer cloth, but not very warm. They wrapped cloth around their legs and arms. They used leather belts to tie everything close to the body. Sometimes they had cloaks, long and heavy, to block the wind. Hoods were common. Gloves were rare. Shoes were simple leather wraps, and the cold often reached their toes. Some peasants even wrapped straw around their feet. They wore their clothes day and night, even in bed, because removing layers meant letting in the cold. At the end of a long day, sleep was not warm or easy. Most peasants slept on straw, not soft mattresses, not pillows, just straw spread on the floor. If they had a bed, it was a wooden frame with ropes tied across. On top of that, more straw. Sometimes animal skins covered the straw for a little warmth. People shared beds. A whole family might sleep together, huddled like puppies. They needed each other's body heat to stay warm. Some slept with their animals. Chickens, dogs, even a pig if they had one. Not for fun, but for warmth. It sounds strange today, but it helped them survive. The nights were long. Cold wind howled through the cracks in the walls. And in some places, frost would creep in and settle on the inside of the windows, if there were windows at all. To stay warm, people also ate differently. Hot food was very important, but they couldn't eat much. Peasants ate simple meals, soups, stews, and porridge. They used big iron pots. Hanging over the fire, they boiled grains, onions, and beans. Sometimes they added roots from the garden. If they had a little meat or bacon fat, they used it sparingly. Salt was a treasure, used to preserve food for the cold months. Drinks were often warm. They made warm beer or hot broth. It filled the belly and helped them sleep. In the coldest times, animals were a blessing, not just for meat or milk, but for warmth. Farm animals like goats, sheep, and pigs were sometimes kept indoors, not in their own rooms. They shared space with the family. In one corner, the family slept. In another corner, The animals lay on straw. Their warm bodies helped raise the temperature of the whole room. It smelled bad. It was noisy, but it kept people alive. This was survival, not comfort. When the sun went down, everything became harder. Winter nights were very dark. Candles were made from tallow, animal fat. They smoked. They smelled. Only the rich had beeswax candles. Most peasants saved their candles. They used them only when needed. Often they sat in the dark, telling stories, praying, waiting for sleep. The dark was not just outside, it was inside too. Inside their homes, inside their hearts. But still they endured, because that's what people did. Voiceover softens. And so, as you begin to drift, remember this: the people of the Middle Ages were not so different from us. They wanted warmth, safety, peace, and somehow, through the cold and the dark, they carried on. We'll continue this quiet journey soon, but for now, let the history fade softly into your dreams. How homes were made in Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, homes were made of thick stone. The walls were cold, very cold, especially in winter. The wind found small holes and blew right inside. There were no heaters, no switches to turn on, just cold stones and thick air. Families had to get close together. They stayed near the fire, but the fire was small. Only one fire in the whole house. It had to keep everyone warm. Sometimes it was enough. The floors were not smooth. They were rough, hard, made of dirt or stone. People's feet were always cold. Socks were rare. Shoes weren't warm. At night, the bed felt like ice. They did not have mattresses like today. They used straw, stuffed into bags. Sometimes with feathers, if you were lucky, but it didn't hold heat for long. So people used wool, blankets made of thick wool, and they wore their clothes to bed. Every layer helped. Even hats. Yes, they wore hats to sleep. Privacy didn't exist. Most of the time, the whole family slept in one room, often in one bed. Mother, father, children, even the baby, all huddled close, not just to save space, to stay alive, to share body heat, to stop their breath from turning into ice. Do they have window glass? No glass windows. Today we have glass. In the Middle Ages, glass was rare. Only churches and castles had it. Regular homes? Just wooden shutters. Sometimes animal skin stretched tight. They called it parchment windows. It let in light, but not warmth. Wind still crept in. So people used thick curtains. Heavy cloths hung over the walls and over the doors to keep the cold out. What about the fire hearth? The hearth was the heart of the home, a stone space for fire. They burned wood, but it was not always easy to find. Sometimes they used dry grass or even dried animal dung. It didn't smell good, but it burned, and that's all they needed. A bit of heat, even just a little. At night, the fire was for warmth, but during the day it was for food. People made soup, thick soup from roots and beans. The steam from the pot gave a little warmth. Everyone sat close, waiting for their turn, but the fire didn't last long. It had to be watched carefully. One spark could burn the whole house. Cold weather meant less food. Nothing grew in winter, so people stored what they could in jars, in bags, in barrels. They ate dried meat, pickled vegetables, hard bread soaked in broth, sometimes just oats, or porridge. Hot meals made the cold feel smaller. Even churches were cold, very cold, but people still went, wrapped in cloaks, hands tucked in side sleeves. They sat on stone benches. No cushions, no heaters, just silence and prayers. Their breath made fog in the air, but faith kept them warm, at least in their hearts. Where and how people work. Most people worked outside, even when it snowed. Farmers still fed the animals. Blacksmiths worked with frozen fingers. Children carried wood, and women washed clothes in cold water. They didn't stop just because it was winter. Life had to go on. What did they wear that time? Clothes were made of wool, layer upon layer. shirts, tunics, cloaks, and fur if they could find it. They tied cloth around their legs and wore hoods to protect their heads. Nothing was easy to put on, and everything felt heavy. But the more you wore, the warmer you stayed, even if you could barely move. How the nighttime was in the village. As night fell, the village grew quiet. Smoke curled slowly from chimneys. The streets were dark. There were no streetlights, only the moon and the stars, and maybe a candle in someone's window. Children yawned. Mothers covered them in thick cloth. Fathers added more logs to the fire. Everyone hoped it would burn all night. If it didn't, they'd wake up freezing. How the cold was and does the effect. The cold brought sickness. Many people got coughs or fevers. There were no doctors like we have now, just herbs and old remedies. Some drank hot water with garlic. Others rubbed wild plants on their skin. But sometimes it didn't help, and people stayed sick for a long time. Or worse, they didn't get better at all. That's why staying warm was so important. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about staying alive. How children survived in the winter. Children still played, even in the snow. They ran through fields, through snowballs made of slush, laughed as their cheeks turned red. But when they came inside, their fingers hurt. The cold clung to their skin, so they sat by the fire, holding warm bowls, listening to their mothers tell stories. Stories of giants, of knights, and of dragons that breathed fire. The fire in the story felt warmer than the one in the hearth. Let's discuss on how winter smells. Winter had a smell. The air was sharp, like smoke and snow. Home smelled of burning wood, of wet boots drying near the fire, of stews bubbling in clay pots. Sometimes it smelled of damp wool, sometimes of old hay, but always it was the smell of survival. What about sharing space with animals? Don't be surprised if I tell you that some families brought animals inside. Yes, I mean animals, like goats, sheep, even chickens. Why? Do you know the reasons? To keep them warm, and to keep people warm too. The animals gave off heat, and their bodies helped warm the room. It was noisy and messy, but necessary, because sometimes even the animals froze outside. The castle life was cold too. You might think castles were better. Big stone walls, tall towers, lots of rooms. But castles were cold too. Very cold. The stone sucked in the chill. Even with thick rugs and tapestries, it wasn't warm. Servants walked with torches. Nobles wore layers of fur. And fires were kept in every hall. Still, the cold crept in. Even the king needed many blankets at night. At that time, water turned to ice indoor. In very cold winters, something strange happened. Water in bowls froze. Even inside the house, you'd wake up to ice. On your water, on the windows, even in the corners of the room. Some people left their doors open during the day to let the sun in, but that only worked for a few hours. Then the cold came back. They have the long nights. Winter nights were long, longer than summer. Sometimes, darkness lasted for 15 hours. People went to bed early. They had nothing else to do. No lights to read. No TV. No phones. Just stories. And dreams. And silence. There was dreams by the fire. While the fire burned low, people dreamed. Of spring. Of green leaves. Of warm days. They dreamed of food. Of festivals. Of music and dancing. But until then, they waited, wrapped in wool, listening to the wind outside, and hoping the fire wouldn't go out. If not for faith and patience, they would have given IP, but the people of the Middle Ages didn't give up. They were strong and patient. They believed in better days. They sang songs in the dark. They prayed by candlelight. They gave thanks for every small warmth, a soft blanket, a hot meal, a flickering flame. They survived, one cold night at a time. Winter food wasn't easy. Food was harder to find in the winter. There were no supermarkets, no refrigerators, no fresh fruits from faraway lands. People had to store food before the cold came. They dried it, salted it, pickled it, smoked it. Vegetables were buried in cool dirt. Meat was hung in cellars. Bread was baked in big batches and kept for weeks. But still, the food didn't always last. And sometimes people went hungry. What did they eat? A winter meal was often simple. Maybe a thick soup with onions and cabbage. Sometimes dried peas or beans. Maybe stale bread dipped in warm broth. Meat was a luxury. If you had pork or chicken, you were lucky. Most people ate what they had, even if it was the same thing every day. And still, they were thankful. How unwanted visitors destroy food. The cold made animals seek shelter too. Mice and rats came inside. They chewed on food stores. They ran across rooftops at night. Cats were treasured, not just as pets, but as protectors. A good cat kept the grain safe. A better cat slept near the fire and warmed your feet. The firewood was a gold. Wood was like treasure. You couldn't survive winter without it. Families gathered firewood all autumn. They carried logs on their backs, tied bundles with rope, stacked them high behind their homes. If you didn't have enough, you would shiver and shake, and sometimes you would wake up. How they struggled for water. Even water was hard to get. The rivers froze. Buckets cracked in the cold. People had to break through ice to fetch water, to boil it, to cook or clean. Cold water stung the skin, but there was no choice. Some stored snow in pots, melted it near the fire. That was their bath. That was their drink. At that time, winter baths were rare. Baths in winter? Rare. And cold. There were no hot showers, no warm taps. You had to heat water in pots. Carry it carefully. Pour it into a tub, if you had one, and by the time you sat down, the water was already cooling. So most people bathed only when needed, maybe once a week, maybe less. They scrubbed with cloth, washed hands and faces, and hoped to stay clean. How they made their clothes. Clothes were made by hand. Wool from sheep, linen from plants. Spinning the thread took hours. Weaving the cloth took days. Sewing the clothes took weeks. Every stitch mattered. Mothers passed down patterns. Daughters learned young. Warm cloaks, woolen socks, layer after layer, made not for fashion, but for survival. You seen 28, blessing of the sheep. Sheep were precious. Their wool was warmth. Families cared for their flocks, even brought them indoors during snow. In spring, they sheared the sheep. In summer, they cleaned the wool. In fall, they spun it. And by winter, it became clothing. Wool was itchy sometimes, but it kept people alive. Do you know about the church bell in winter? Even in cold, the church bell rang, calling people to prayer, to hope, to stillness. Villagers walked through snow, wrapped in shawls, carrying candles, their breath in the air like mist. Inside the stone church, it was cold too, but the people sang, their voices rising with warmth, lifting hearts, lifting spirits. In the morning after the storm, and when the storm passed, when the snow melted just a little, people stepped outside. The roofs were white, the trees were quiet, birds were few, but the sky was clear and calm. Children made tracks in the snow. Elders gathered wood again. Everyone kept going, because that's what they did. They endured, gathering by the hearth. Even the smallest fire gave great comfort. In the center of most homes was the hearth. It was more than fireplace. It was the heart of the home. People gathered around it, to cook, to talk, to simply stay warm. Fathers told stories. Mothers spun thread. Children nibbled on bread and stared into the flames. The hearth was warmth. It was light. And in the long, frozen months, it was life. At that time, families were closer in winter. Families slept closer in winter, sometimes in one room, sometimes in one bed, layered in blankets, wearing wool socks, with dogs and even goats sleeping beside them. They didn't have privacy, but they had protection, warmth shared between bodies, stories whispered in the dark, songs hummed through the chill. Winter drew them together, and for a time, the cold was a little less cold. How they keep the home alive. There was always something to do, even in winter. The cold didn't stop chores. It just made them slower. Ash had to be swept. Bread had to be made. Children had to be watched. Mothers repaired clothes by firelight. Fathers checked the roof for snow weight. Older siblings fetched water with frozen fingers. And when the wind howled outside, inside hands stayed busy, because stillness could mean sorrow. At any moment, their hope was in prayer. For many, hope lived in faith. People prayed often. They prayed for warmth, for food, for mercy. Monks in their stone monasteries prayed in silence. Villagers knelt in wooden chapels. Children were taught to thank God for every small comfort: a warm spoon of stew, a dry cloak, a day without frostbite. Faith was like a blanket. You could not see it, but it kept many warm. They shared folk tales in firelight. Stories were passed down in winter, tales of nights, of wolves in the woods, of spirits in the snow. Some were scary, others silly, but each one kept minds alive and imaginations warm. Old women told tales with wide eyes and low voices. Little ones clung to each word, and the snow outside didn't seem so big anymore. How the tracks in the snow be? After a fresh snow, villagers looked for tracks: foxes, hares, sometimes wolves. Hunters followed trails with quiet steps. Children pointed them out with wonder. The snow spoke to those who could read it. It told stories of the forest, of who had passed through, and what dangers might be near. But sometimes the snow was quiet, and that silence was the loudest thing of all. Winter made people dream of autumn, of apple picking, of warm bread, of colorful leaves falling in slow spirals. They missed the sun on their faces, the songs of birds, the green of the world. But they also knew winter made spring sweeter, and every season told its own story. Nights in medieval winter were very long. The sun vanished early. The stars stayed late. People lit candles, told quiet stories, and drifted into sleep wrapped in fur and wool. Dreams came easier in the cold, sometimes strange, sometimes peaceful. The wind sang lullabies through cracks in the wall, and sleep felt like floating through a snow-covered cloud. How bells rang in midnight in the churches. At midnight, some heard the church bell, a soft sound in the silent snow, calling for prayer, calling for hope, a reminder that even in darkness, there was light, a bell in the cold, a song in the silence, a promise that dawn would return. When it's morning, it became so cold but bright, and when the sky turned pale, when the birds gave a quiet chirp, when frost sparkled like diamonds on the hay, another day had come, not easier, not warmer, but new. And with each new day, the people of the Middle Ages endured. They worked, they prayed, they loved, and slowly, step by frozen step, but still they survived it. In winter, peasants had to eat what they stored during summer and fall. There were no supermarkets or freezers. People had to be smart and careful with food. They dried beans and peas. They salted meat. They smoked fish. They stored apples and root vegetables in cool cellars. Do you know that bread was the most common food? But in winter, the grain was harder to keep dry. If the grain became moldy, it could make people sick. Still, people baked what they could. They added dried herbs and sometimes old cheese for flavor. Most meals were just a thick bread soup called pottage. If someone got sick in winter, it was a big problem. There were no doctors in villages. People used herbs and home remedies. Garlic was used for coughs. Warm beer with spices was given for chills. Sometimes a mix of honey and onion was used for sore throats. These were old tricks passed down by grandmothers. Fires were a luxury. What was hard to find and gather. Peasants had to walk to forests to chop trees, but that was dangerous in winter. Snow covered roots and made people trip. Sometimes wild animals hid in the woods. Inside homes, the only warm place was near the fire. The rest of the room stayed cold. Frost crept on the inside walls. People wore hats indoors. They even slept with animals like goats or dogs to stay warm. Children felt the cold the most. They often cried at night. Their hands and feet turned red and sore. There were no gloves or boots for many kids, just cloth wrapped around their legs. Older people suffered too. Their bones ached in the cold. If they got too sick, they often didn't make it until spring. Life was harsh, and winter was the hardest time. But peasants kept going. They told stories by the fire. They sang songs to forget their hunger. They believed spring would come, even if it felt far away. They found happiness in the Middle Ages. Churches were some of the biggest buildings in the village. They were made from stones which stayed cold all year round. You should know that people didn't go there to get warm, but they went there to pray and to also find peace. Inside, it was quiet to the extent you could not hear any sound. The wind couldn't come in all. There were small windows with a high above the ground, but sunlight came through colored glass, painting soft lights on the walls. It felt magical, even if it was cold. Sometimes people gathered there during winter storms. They sat close together. They sang songs, old songs. It helped them forget how cold their toes were. The church had no fireplace, but it gave people hope. They believed that prayers could bring warmth to the heart, and sometimes that was enough. Monks lived in monasteries next to churches. They followed strict routines. They woke early, even before the sun, even in the cold. Monks wore simple robes. In winter, they added woolen cloaks. Still, they felt the cold in their fingers as they wrote books by hand. Their rooms had no heat. To stay warm, they walked, they worked, they prayed, they endured. Sometimes, rich people gave the monks money to help the poor. The monks would share soup, warm bread, a blanket. It wasn't much, but in a world where many had nothing, it meant everything. Even the ringing of the church bell brought comfort. It meant someone was there. Someone was watching over the village. And so, under the cold stone arches, people found warmth not in fire, but in faith. The wind in winter was more than just cold. It whispered through trees. It sang across rooftops. It told stories to those who listened. To the medieval farmer, the sound of the wind meant something. Sometimes, it meant a storm was coming. Sometimes, it meant nothing at all. But always it reminded them they were small, and nature was big. How the frozen rivers and silent streams were. In the coldest months, rivers froze. The water that once bubbled and flowed now stood still and silent. Children walked on the frozen banks. Some tried to skate using bones tied to their shoes. They laughed and slipped and laughed again. But the stillness of frozen water, it was a warning too. It meant animals would struggle. It meant fishing was hard. It meant time was still. Do you know what the cold broke? Cold broke things. The wooden walls cracked. The thatch let in snow. Leather stiffened. Iron grew brittle. Men fixed roofs with frozen hands. Women patched boots with frozen needles. Children helped too, tying things, fetching tools, holding candles as the sun went down. The cold didn't stop life, but it made it harder. Every crack in a home was a door for the cold, so they sealed. They stuffed straw. They kept the cold out as best they could. How working in the cold time? The field slept, but not the people. Men still went out to cut wood, to dig earth, to check animals. They wore layers, wool, leather, cloaks heavy with frost. They walked through snow, like ghosts from long ago. Their breath steamed like smoke. Their fingers burned with cold. But the work had to be done. If they stopped, the cold would win. How wood became everything. Wood was precious, more than gold in winter. It burned in the fire. It held up the roof. It made tools. It built beds. Boys were sent to gather branches. Fathers chopped trees on cold hills. Each log carried inside was a victory over the cold. Each spark in the fire, a promise that the night would pass. Let's know about the candlelight and shadows. In the quiet of the night, candles glowed. They flickered. They danced. they lit the pages of books. In quiet monasteries, they lit the faces of mothers, rocking babies to sleep. They lit the walls of stone halls and the corners of muddy homes. Candles were more than light. They were comfort. They were calm. When all else was cold, candlelight felt warm. How the warm food warm our hearts. Hot food mattered. It warmed the hands. It warmed the belly. It warmed the soul. Simple meals, porridge, stew, boiled roots, sometimes meat, often not, bread dipped in broth, beans warmed over fire. Not fancy, not sweet, but after hours in the cold, a hot bowl in hand was the greatest treasure. The village priest's blessing all the time. In some villages, the priest came to each home. He brought blessings. He brought prayers. He sprinkled water on doors. He whispered words of hope. For many, it meant peace. For others, just routine. But all were quiet when he spoke, because the cold took many, and any blessing was welcome. Do you know how the first rooster called? As night gave way to morning, a sound cut the silence. The rooster, he crowed in the frost. He crowed like it was spring. It meant one thing. The night had ended. Again. And no matter how cold the world had been, they were still here, still breathing, still living. A soft thought before sleeping. And when the cold grew worse, when the snow piled high, when the wind howled louder than before, they closed their eyes and thought of warmer days, of green hills, of apple trees, of the sun on their backs. They dreamt as the fire cracked and hissed, and slowly the cold world faded into soft, quiet sleep. Villagers had smaller homes, made from wood, mud, and straw. Their roofs were thatched, made from dried grass. Snow would sit heavy on top. Inside the homes, there was only one room, one fire, one big bed for the whole family. Father, mother, children, even the baby and the dog. They slept close together. It was the only way to stay warm. Sometimes they wore all their clothes to bed. During the day, they worked with numb hands, chopping wood, feeding animals, breaking ice from the water barrels. There was no bathroom inside. They had to step outside, even in snow, even in the wind. The outhouse was cold and dark. So many waited until morning, or used a small pot inside. Food was simple in winter. Bread, turnips, dried beans from summer. Meat was rare. If they had some, it was salted or smoked, to make it last the whole season. The cold crept into their fingers and toes. Sometimes it never left. Frostbite was not understood, but they saw black toes, and they knew it was bad. Still, they sang songs, soft songs by the fire. They told old stories, and made each other laugh. It helped them forget the cold, just for a little while. In those tiny houses with snow outside and fire inside, families stayed close, hearts warm, even when the world was cold. As the cold wind blew outside, people began to whisper stories. Old, strange stories from long ago. Winter was not just cold. It was also strange, mysterious. People believed the cold brought spirits, wandering souls, dark creatures hiding in snow. They said, if you heard whistling in the wind, it wasn't just a breeze. It was a spirit passing by your window. Some thought winter was a time when the dead walked, not in scary ways, but quiet, lonely. Children were told to stay close to the fire, to never go outside at night, because something might be waiting. They placed charms above the doors, bits of iron, bundles of herbs, to keep away bad luck, to chase off cold spirits. Some believe in creatures called Jack Frost. He was not kind. They said he would pinch your skin, turn your fingers blue. So parents told children, keep your gloves on, or Jack Frost will visit. Stories helped pass the time. They were a little scary, but also a little fun. In many homes, grandmothers were the storytellers. They sat near the fire, their voice soft and slow. The children listened, eyes wide, feet tucked under blankets. Voice over direction. very gentle now, like tucking a child. And so the nights were long, but not silent. They were filled with tales of snow and spirits, of danger and wonder, and the warmth of family nearby. Not every day was hard. Even in the Middle Ages, people found joy. In winter, children still played. Even in the snow, they made little snowmen, not like today's, but small ones with sticks and bits of cloth. They called them snow dolls. Some kids threw snowballs, but not too many. They didn't want to waste strength. They also played a game with sticks and balls on the frozen rivers, like an early version of hockey. They used wooden shoes or wrapped cloth on their feet to slide. Even adults joined sometimes. They needed laughter too. In cold times, laughter was a warm blanket. Even just a little bit of fun helped people forget the frost outside. Inside, families played simple games. They told riddles. They sang quiet songs. They carved little animals from wood. Children learned to knit or sew or help cook. And they made up stories. Big stories. About dragons, kings, magic snow. These stories made the cold feel less scary. Winter didn't stop happiness. It just changed the way people found it. People shared what little they had: warm bread, a boiled turnip, a cup of cider. Even small things felt big. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And that made all the difference. And while the wind howled outside, inside, there was still warmth, still laughter, still love. In the coldest months, food was more than food. It was survival. It was comfort. It was hope. Winter made food hard to find. Fields were frozen. No crops could grow. Animals were hiding or gone. So people prepared before winter came. They stored food. They dried fruits. They salted meat. They smoked fish over fires. Cheese was kept in cellars. Grain was kept in sacks. And cabbages were buried in straw to keep them from freezing. Every meal was simple but full of care. Soups were common. Hot water, a few onions, maybe a carrot, some barley. If lucky, a small piece of meat. Sometimes it was just broth, made from old bones and boiled herbs. But it was warm, and that mattered more than taste. They also ate black bread, thick, heavy, made from rye or dark wheat. They dipped it in soup to make it soft. Hard bread could crack a tooth. Warm food, even just a bowl of soup, was like gold in winter. Some made thick porridge, boiled oats or barley, sometimes with milk or a bit of honey. The rich had roasted meats, spice wines, big feasts with wild boar and sweet pies. But the poor ate simple meals, root vegetables, old apples, grain gruel. Still they gave thanks. They were grateful because even simple food kept them alive. And on special days like Christmas, they might share a small treat, maybe nuts, maybe a piece of cheese. Even a hot drink made from spice water and herbs felt like a celebration. Cold winters were hard, but a warm meal made life feel possible again. In medieval times, people went to bed early. There was no electricity, no bright lights. When the sun went down, the world turned dark. They used candles or oil lamps, but those were expensive, so most people went to bed soon after dusk. Voice-over direction, warm tone, with gentle wonder. But the way they slept was very different from today. Poor people often slept on straw, not on beds, not on soft pillows. They made mats from hay or dried leaves. Sometimes they used old cloth as blankets. The cold air crept through the cracks in the walls. There was no insulation, no heating, just layers of clothes and body warmth. To stay warm, they slept close together. Whole families shared one bed, parents, children, sometimes even grandparents. It was called a family bed. Even travelers or servants might sleep near the fire, in barns, or beside animals. Some slept sitting up, leaning against the wall. Others wore all their clothes to bed, even hats and boots. Sleep was cold. Sleep was rough, but it still gave them rest. In castles, the rich had beds with curtains. Thick fabric helped keep the warmth in. Their beds were high, with wooden frames. They stuffed the mattresses with feathers or wool. Still, even they felt the cold. The stone walls were icy, and the fires only warmed one side of the room. So they curled up, wrapped in furs, and hoped for good dreams. People slept in two parts. First sleep and second sleep. They would wake up for a short while in the middle of the night, then go back to bed. During that time, some prayed, some thought quietly, some even visited neighbors. It was a quiet time, a moment between the dark and the dawn. Cold winters made sleep harder, but people managed. They stayed close. They used what they had, and somehow they made it to morning. The night was long. The bed was cold, but sleep was a small comfort in the middle of a hard world. In the Middle Ages, animals were not just animals. They were warmth. They were survival. When nights got colder than bones could bear, people turned to the barn, to the stable, to the creatures that share their world. In small homes, animals often lived inside. Chickens, goats, even pigs. They didn't just keep animals for food, they kept them for heat. Cows gave off a lot of warmth. Their breath steamed the air, their bodies radiated heat. A sleeping cow could warm a whole corner of a house. Sometimes, families brought the animals into the house at night, not just to protect the animals, but to protect themselves. Yes, medieval people slept near goats, even pigs. They were like living blankets. Dogs lay by the fire. Cats curled near children's feet. Even wild animals were welcome sometimes, if they helped keep the chill away. Hay and straw also helped. They put it on the floors. They wrapped it around the animals and around themselves. It wasn't clean. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. In monasteries, monks kept sheep and donkeys near their rooms. In villages, a single ox might be the whole family's warmth. People built low roofs to trap animal heat. No space was wasted, not even in winter. Sometimes the animals snored louder than the humans, but everyone was grateful. They were all trying to survive. When spring came, some animals were taken outside again, but many remained near the people as if they understood how they had helped. In hard winters, there were no pets or livestock. There were only survivors, man and beast, sleeping side by side. In the coldest chapter of the world's story, even kings, even queens, shivered in the cold. Castles may look strong and powerful from the outside. Tall towers, thick stone walls, big wooden doors. But inside, they were cold, very cold. You might think castles were cozy, but stone doesn't keep heat. It keeps cold. The floors were hard, made of stone. The walls were damp, made of stone. The windows had no glass, just open holes with shutters. Cold air blew through them, like a ghost whispering through the halls. The wind had no manners. It blew under doors, over beds, and into bones. In the great halls, big fireplaces roared, but they only warmed what was right in front of them. Step just 5 feet away, and it was freezing again. The ceilings were high. The heat rose and got lost. The poor servants on the lower floors never felt it. Even kings wore for indoors. Even queens wrapped their hands in cloth. They had stone beds with wooden frames, heavy blankets made of wool. Sometimes they even slept sitting up because lying down made them colder. People placed heated stones in their beds. Hot coals were put into pans and tucked near their feet. But it didn't last long. Heat was always leaving, and cold always came back. Servants had it worse. They slept in kitchens, in narrow beds near walls, sometimes with only thin blankets. They wore layers even while they worked, wool tunics, linen shirts, sometimes even furs they weren't supposed to have. The cold didn't care if you were a lord or a cook. At night, when torches were blown out and the castle fell silent, The cold grew louder. It crept into beds. It whispered into ears. It waited for morning. Castles were strong, but not even they could hold back the winter.